I worked 40 years for my family. They sold the family home without telling me. The first time I realized that Oak Ridge House wasn't technically mine was on my 12th birthday. My father, Thomas Whitaker, had summoned me to his study, a room filled with leather-bound books he rarely read and a mahogany desk that seemed to swallow half the space. He was not a tall man, but in that room, seated behind that desk, he commanded a presence that made him seem monumental. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that formal tone he used when discussing matters of importance. "I want to talk to you about your future." I remember fidgeting with the hem of my dress, a white cotton thing with small blue flowers that my mother insisted I wear for the occasion. The dress was itchy, and I longed to be outside in the garden where the first roses of summer were beginning to bloom. "Yes, Father? Oak Ridge has been in our family for 5 generations, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the window where, beyond the glass, the sprawling Victorian mansion's shadow stretched across the front lawn. "One day it will belong to your brother Albert, as the firstborn son." I remember feeling a flicker of something, not quite disappointment, not quite anger, but a dull ache of recognition. Even at 12, I understood the unwritten rules that governed our lives. Albert, 4 years my senior, would inherit everything. I had always known this on some level, but hearing it stated so plainly made it suddenly, painfully real. "But," my father continued, leaning forward slightly, "that doesn't mean you don't have a place here. Family is everything, Margaret, and this house needs people who care for it, who love it. I've seen how you tend to your mother's garden, how carefully you arrange the flowers throughout the house. You have a gift for making Oak Ridge feel like a home." I remember the warm flush of pride at those words. My father rarely gave compliments. "Which is why I want to ask something of you," he said. "A family duty, if you will. I want you to promise that you'll always look after Oak Ridge, that you'll help keep our family's legacy alive." "I promise," I said without hesitation, my voice carrying a solemnity that belied my years. My father smiled, a rare occurrence, and nodded, as if sealing some invisible contract between us. "Good. That's settled then." Looking back now, 61 years later, I can see that moment for what it was. The beginning of a lifetime of servitude disguised as familial obligation. But at 12, all I felt was a sense of purpose, of belonging. I had been given a role, a responsibility. I was needed. That night I went to sleep feeling as though I'd been entrusted with something precious. I didn't yet understand that I was being prepared for a life where my needs would always come second to those of the house and the family name it represented. The irony is that I spent the next 40 years faithfully keeping that childhood promise, only to discover that promises in the Whitaker family apparently only flowed in one direction. I was born Margaret Elizabeth Whitaker on June 15, 1951, the second child and only daughter of Thomas and Eleanor Whitaker. My birth certificate lists my place of birth as Oak Ridge House, Lakeshore, Connecticut, though Oak Ridge doesn't appear on any official maps. It was simply what our family had always called the sprawling Victorian mansion that sat on 5 acres at the edge of town, overlooking Lake Champlain. The house itself was built in 1886 by my great-great-grandfather, William Whitaker, who made his fortune in textiles during the Industrial Revolution. Family legend had it that he designed the house himself, incorporating architectural elements from his travels across Europe. Gothic arches, Romanesque columns, and ornate cornices that seemed to belong on different buildings altogether. The result was a magnificent monstrosity. 32 rooms, including 7 bedrooms, a library, a ballroom, and countless nooks and oddly shaped spaces that had no clear purpose. By the time I was born, the textile fortune had dwindled considerably. My father worked as a professor of English literature at the small liberal arts college in town, and my mother occasionally took in sewing work, though she would never have called it a job. "It's just a favor for friends," she would say, as if the idea of a Whitaker woman working for money was somehow beneath our station. The reality, though we never spoke of it directly, was that maintaining Oak Ridge was expensive. The property taxes alone would have purchased a modest house elsewhere in town. Then there were the constant repairs, the leaky roof, the temperamental boiler, the plumbing that groaned and shuddered in protest whenever more than one faucet was running. Oak Ridge was beautiful, but it was also a hungry beast that devoured resources and attention. Despite these financial strains, we lived with the trappings of old money. We had dinners on the fine china that had been passed down through generations. We maintained memberships at the country club where my father played golf every Saturday with the town's other professionals. We attended the Episcopal Church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew that Whitakers had occupied since the church was built. To the outside world, we were still the prominent family who lived in the grand house on the hill. Albert, my brother, was groomed from an early age to carry on the family legacy. He was sent to Phillips Exeter Academy for high school, then to Yale, where our father and grandfather had attended. I, on the other hand, attended the local public school until 10th grade, at which point my mother determined that I needed finishing and enrolled me in Miss Porter's school, a considerably less prestigious institution than my brother's, but one that would, in her words, prepare me for society. What this preparation entailed was never entirely clear to me. I was taught how to arrange flowers, how to plan menus for dinner parties, how to converse pleasantly on innocuous topics, and how to deflect any conversation that veered toward the controversial or intellectual. I was, in short, being trained to be the perfect complement to a successful man, a role I never particularly aspired to, but one that was expected of women of my background and generation. By the time I graduated from Miss Porter's in 1969, the world was changing rapidly. Women were burning bras and demanding equal rights. Young people were protesting the Vietnam War and experimenting with drugs and free love. But within the walls of Oak Ridge, time seemed to stand still. My parents expected me to attend a respectable women's college, perhaps Smith or Wellesley, and then return home until I married a suitable young man from our social circle. I had other ideas. I wanted to study architecture at Rhode Island School of Design. I had always been fascinated by buildings, by the way spaces could be designed to influence how people felt and behaved within them. I loved Oak Ridge despite its flaws and had secretly dreamed of one day redesigning parts of it, of bringing light into its darker corners and making it more livable without sacrificing its historical character. When I announced this plan at dinner one evening in the spring of 1969, my father's fork clattered against his plate, and my mother pressed a hand to her chest as if I'd suggested something obscene. "Architecture?" my father repeated, his tone, suggesting I might as well have said I wanted to become a professional gambler. "That's hardly appropriate, Margaret." "Why not?" I asked, feeling a rare surge of defiance. "I'm good at mathematics, and I've always loved drawing. Professor Winters said my portfolio is strong enough for admission." "Professor Winters should mind his own business," my father muttered. "What your father means," my mother interjected with a strained smile, "is that architecture is a very demanding field. It would be difficult to balance a career like that with a family." "What if I don't want a family right away?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted them as I watched my mother's face fall. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitaker," my father said, using my full name as he did when particularly displeased. "I will not have this conversation at the dinner table. Your mother and I have already discussed your education, and we believe Wellesley would be the perfect place for you. They have an excellent art history program if you're interested in buildings." And just like that, my dream was dismissed. Not explicitly forbidden, but redirected toward something more suitable. I could study buildings, but only in the abstract historical sense. I could appreciate architecture, but not create it. I didn't argue further that night. I had been raised to be accommodating, to avoid direct confrontation. But in my room later, I cried tears of frustration into my pillow. It wasn't just about architecture. It was about having the freedom to choose my own path, to be more than an ornamental addition to someone else's life. The next morning, I came downstairs to find my mother in the garden, cutting roses for the dining room table. She looked up as I approached, and I could tell from her expression that she had been waiting for me. "Your father means well," she said without preamble. "He only wants what's best for you. But he doesn't even know what I want," I replied, helping her gather the cut flowers into her basket. My mother sighed and straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair back under her gardening hat. "Margaret, there are certain realities we women have to accept. The world is changing, yes, but not as quickly as young people think. A woman in architecture would face enormous challenges. Why put yourself through that when there are easier paths?" "Because I might be good at it," I said simply. "Because I might love it." My mother looked at me for a long moment, her expression softening. "I know what it's like to have dreams, darling. When I was your age, I wanted to study botany. Can you imagine? But I met your father, and then Albert came along, and then you, and somehow life just happened differently. And I don't regret it. I have a beautiful garden and a beautiful family." There was something in her voice, a wistfulness, a hint of what might have been, that made my heart ache. I wondered if, 30 years from then, I would be saying similar words to a daughter of my own, justifying the compromises I had made. "But what about what I want?" I asked softly. "What about Oakridge?" she countered. "Your father and I won't be here forever. Albert will inherit the house, of course, but he has his own life to lead. He's talking about law school, perhaps a political career. Someone needs to care for this place, to preserve it for future generations." And there it was, the real reason for their opposition. It wasn't just about propriety or traditional gender roles, it was about keeping me tethered to Oakridge, ensuring that the family home would always have a devoted caretaker. So, that's my purpose? To be the custodian of an old house? It's not just a house, Margaret. It's our heritage, our history. Every corner of Oakridge tells a story about who we are. Without it, we're just people. With it, we're Whitakers. She handed me the basket of roses. "Just think about it, please." "For me?" I took the basket, feeling the weight of more than just flowers in my hands. I was holding the expectations of generations, the unspoken contract that had been established on my 12th birthday. I had promised to care for Oakridge, and in the Whitaker family, promises were binding. 2 weeks later, I declined my acceptance to RISD and enrolled at Wellesley College, where I dutifully studied art history with a focus on architectural styles. I told myself it was a compromise, a way to honor both my own interests and my family's expectations. But deep down, I knew I had capitulated. I had chosen the path of least resistance, the one that would keep the peace and maintain my place within the family fold. It would be the first of many such choices, the first of many dreams deferred in service to Oakridge and the Whitaker name. Arisur Chapter 2, The Return. I graduated from Wellesley in the spring of 1973 with a degree in art history and no clear plan for what came next. While many of my classmates were pursuing graduate studies or entering the workforce, riding the wave of feminism that was opening doors previously closed to women, I returned to Oakridge, ostensibly to figure things out. In truth, there wasn't much to figure out. The path had been laid before me long ago, and I was simply following it, one reluctant step at a time. My father had suffered a mild heart attack during my senior year, and though he recovered, the episode served as a stark reminder of mortality. My mother, always anxious by nature, had become even more so in the wake of his health scare. They didn't explicitly ask me to come home, but the expectation hung in the air during my graduation weekend, unspoken but palpable. "It would be so lovely to have you back at Oakridge for a while," my mother said as we drove home from Wellesley, the car packed with my belongings. Just until you settle on your next steps, of course. I nodded, watching the familiar Connecticut landscape roll by outside the window. We both knew there would be no next steps, at least none that took me away from Lakeshore. I was 22 years old, and already I could feel the walls of my future closing in around me. Albert, meanwhile, had indeed gone to law school as planned. By the time I returned to Oak Ridge, he was in his second year at Harvard Law and engaged to Catherine Blackwell, the daughter of a prominent Boston family. They had met at a charity gala, the kind of meeting that our parents would describe as fortuitous, but that I suspected had been carefully orchestrated by matchmaking mothers. Albert and Catherine visited Oak Ridge occasionally on weekends, arriving in his new BMW and bringing bottles of wine that my father would pronounce excellent, regardless of their quality. Catherine was perfectly pleasant, pretty in a conventional way, well-educated but not intimidatingly so, and unfailingly polite. She called my parents Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, despite their insistence that she use their first names, and she always brought thoughtful hostess gifts. Handmade soaps from a boutique in Boston, artisanal chocolates, or small potted plants for my mother's garden. During these visits, the conversation inevitably turned to their future plans. Where they would live after graduation, Boston initially with an eye toward Washington, D.C., if Albert's political ambitions materialized. How many children they hoped to have, at least 2, preferably 3, and what Catherine planned to do with her English literature degree. Nothing professional, of course. She would focus on charitable work and supporting Albert's career. I would sit quietly during these discussions, offering appropriate smiles and nods, while internally questioning how 2 people my age could have their entire lives so neatly mapped out. There was something both admirable and terrifying about such certainty. One Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1973, after Albert and Catherine had departed for Boston, my father called me into his study, the same room where, 10 years earlier, he had extracted my promise to care for Oak Ridge. "Sit down, Margaret," he said, gesturing to the leather armchair across from his desk. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and furniture polish, scents I would forever associate with serious conversations. "I want to discuss your future." I perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded in my lap. "What about it?" "It's been several months since you graduated, and while we've been delighted to have you home, your mother and I are concerned that you don't seem to be progressing." Progressing. Toward what exactly? I asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, toward establishing yourself, your life. Most young women your age are either pursuing further education, starting careers, or..." He trailed off. "Or getting married," I finished for him. "Yes, precisely. Now I understand that times are changing, and women have more options available to them. Your mother and I are not opposed to you pursuing appropriate employment if that's what you desire. Perhaps something at the college? Professor Winters mentioned that the art history department is looking for an administrative assistant." I bit back a bitter laugh. From aspiring architect to administrative assistant, such were the adjusted expectations for a Whitaker daughter. "I'll consider it," I said noncommittally. Good, good." My father nodded, seemingly relieved that I hadn't outright rejected the suggestion. "And as for the other matter, well, your mother and I were thinking it might be nice if you attended the Hendersons' holiday party next month. Their son James has recently returned from graduate school in England. Very bright young man, studying economics." "I believe you knew him slightly in high school?" James Henderson. I vaguely recalled a tall, somewhat awkward boy who had been 2 years ahead of me at Lakeshore High, before he'd been sent off to boarding school. We had barely exchanged 10 words. "I remember him," I said neutrally. "Excellent. The party is on December 15th. I've already told Charles and Evelyn that we'll be attending as a family." And just like that, my social calendar was being arranged. For me, complete with a pre-approved potential suitor. I wanted to object, to tell my father that I was perfectly capable of managing my own social life, but I knew it would be futile. In the Whitaker household, suggestions from my father carried the weight of commands. "Is that all?" I asked, rising from the chair. My father looked momentarily taken aback by my abruptness, but nodded. "Yes, that's all for now. Oh, and Margaret," he added as I reached the door. "Mrs. Sullivan mentioned that the East Wing gutters need cleaning. Perhaps you could see to that tomorrow. Your mother worries about the latter." And there it was, the real reason for my return to Oak Ridge, laid bare in a casual request. I was to be the caretaker, the one who climbed ladders and cleaned gutters so that my aging parents wouldn't have to, the one who would maintain the family home while Albert pursued his grand ambitions elsewhere. "Of course," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I'll take care of it." The next day, I spent 3 hours on a rickety extension ladder, scooping decomposing leaves and twigs from the gutters of Oak Ridge's East Wing. It was tedious, dirty work, but there was also a strange satisfaction in it. Unlike the nebulous expectations surrounding my social life and career prospects, this was a task with a clear beginning, middle, and end. When I finished, the gutters were clean. It was a small accomplishment, but it was tangible in a way that much of my life at that time was not. As the months passed, I fell into a routine at Oak Ridge. I took the administrative position at the college, working 3 days a week in the art history department. The job was unchallenging but pleasant enough. I helped organize slides for lectures, maintained the department's library of art books, and occasionally assisted students with research projects. On my days off, I attended to Oak Ridge. I learned to replace broken window panes, to refinish scratched hardwood floors, to identify the source of mysterious leaks. I studied the house's ancient boiler system until I understood its quirks and could coax heat from it on the coldest winter mornings without calling the repairman. I cataloged the family's collection of antique furniture and had pieces reupholstered when necessary. I planted new rose varieties in my mother's garden and pruned the century-old oak trees that gave the property its name. In short, I became exactly what my father had envisioned on my 12th birthday: the guardian of Oak Ridge, the keeper of the Whitaker legacy. And if sometimes, late at night, I took out my old architectural sketches and dreamed of what might have been, well, those moments were private, shared only with the creaking timbers of the old house that had become both my home and my prison. The Hendersons' holiday party came and went. James Henderson proved to be as dull in adulthood as he had been in adolescence, though he had developed a certain polish during his time in England. We danced once, made awkward small talk about the weather in London versus Connecticut, and then mutually sought escape from each other's company. My father was visibly disappointed, but he didn't push the matter further. Instead, he and my mother redoubled their efforts to integrate me into Lakeshire's social scene. I was volunteered for committees at the church, invited to join the garden club, and strongly encouraged to attend every eligible bachelor-containing event within a 30-mile radius. I went along with most of it, partly out of a desire to please my parents, and partly because I had little else to occupy my time. It was at one such event, a fundraising gala for the Lakeshire Historical Society in the spring of 1974, that I met David Mitchell. David was not from Lakeshire. He had recently moved to town to take a position teaching American history at the same college where my father taught English literature. He was 30, 8 years my senior, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly air. He was standing alone by the punch bowl when I approached, looking as out of place as I felt. "Not much of a party person?" I asked, helping myself to a cup of the overly sweet punch. He looked up, startled, then smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, not the practiced social expression I was accustomed to seeing at these events. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to a fellow sufferer," I replied, surprising myself with my candor. David laughed, and I found myself laughing with him. A real laugh, not the polite titter I usually employed in social situations. We fell into conversation easily after that, discussing everything from the questionable architectural choices of the Lakeshire Town Hall, where the gala was being held, to the merits of various historical preservation techniques. "You seem to know a lot about architecture for a history professor," I observed after David had delivered a surprisingly astute critique of the building's neoclassical facade. "My father was an architect," he explained. "I grew up surrounded by blueprints and models. I actually considered following in his footsteps before history won out. I wanted to study architecture," I found myself confessing, "at RISD, but it didn't work out." "Why not?" he asked, his expression genuinely curious. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the complex web of family expectations and personal compromises that had led me to Wellesley instead of RISD. "It's complicated," I finally said. "Family considerations." David nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it's never too late, you know. RISD has excellent graduate programs." The casual way he said it, as if returning to my abandoned dream was a real possibility rather than a fantasy, took my breath away. Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow, her smile tight with disapproval. "Margaret, dear, I've been looking everywhere for you. Mrs. Caldwell was just asking about your wonderful work with the church flower arrangements." She turned to David, extending her hand. "Eleanor Whitaker. I don't believe we've met." "David Mitchell," he replied, shaking her hand. "I'm new to the history department at the college." "Oh, you must know my husband, Thomas Whitaker. He's in English literature." "Yes, I've had the pleasure. Professor Whitaker has been very welcoming." My mother's smile warmed slightly at this favorable mention of my father. "How lovely. Well, I'm sure Margaret has been making you feel at home, in Lakeshire as well. She knows simply everyone, don't you, dear?" "Hardly, Mother," I murmured, embarrassed by her transparent attempt to establish my social credentials. "Don't be modest," my mother chided before turning back to David. "Will you be staying in Lakeshire long, Mr. Mitchell?" "That's the plan. I've just purchased a small house on Maple Street." "Oh?" My mother's eyebrows rose slightly. Maple Street was a respectable address, though not among the town's most prestigious. "How nice for you. Well, we must have you over to Oakridge sometime. Margaret can show you around. The house has quite a fascinating history, if you're interested in that sort of thing." "I'd like that very much," David said, glancing at me with a smile that made my cheeks warm. "Wonderful. Margaret, Mrs. Caldwell is waiting. We shouldn't keep her." My mother took my arm, clearly intending to steer me away. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Mitchell," I said, allowing myself to be led away but glancing back over my shoulder. "David, please," he called after me. "And likewise, Margaret." For the remainder of the evening, I found my gaze repeatedly drawn to David as he moved through the crowd, engaged in conversation with various faculty members and town officials. Once or twice, I caught him looking back at me, and each time, he offered a small smile that felt like a shared secret. On the drive, home. My mother was unusually quiet. It wasn't until we were pulling into Oakridge's long, winding driveway that she spoke. "Mr. Mitchell seems interesting," she said, her tone careful. "Yes, he does," I agreed, equally cautious. "Not quite from our usual circle, though." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "He's a history professor at the college, Mother. Hardly a radical element." "Of course not, dear. I just meant, well, he's new to town. We don't know much about his background." "His father was an architect," I offered. "He grew up in Boston. He studied at Brown and then got his PhD from Columbia. He likes historical preservation and thinks the town hall facade is ostentatious." My mother gave me a sideways glance. "You learned quite a lot about him in a short conversation." "He was easy to talk to," I said simply. My mother sighed as, My father pulled the car to a stop in front of Oakridge's imposing entrance. Just be careful, Margaret. Men like that, academics without family connections, they can be unpredictable. I didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with my mother's thinly veiled classism. Instead, I filed away the memory of my conversation with David Mitchell like a pressed flower in a book, something beautiful and rare to be revisited in private moments. What I didn't realize then was that my encounter with David would be the catalyst for a series of events that would alter the course of my life, and ultimately, my relationship with Oakridge itself. 2 days after the gala, I was working at the Aya College when there was a knock on the art history department's office door. I looked up from the stack of slides I was organizing to find David Mitchell standing in the doorway, a tentative smile on his face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," I replied, setting aside the slides and trying to ignore the sudden flutter in my stomach. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I was wondering if you might be available for lunch. There's a new cafe that opened on Main Street, and I've been told their sandwiches are worth trying." I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was just past noon, and I typically ate my packed lunch at my desk. "I don't usually take a full lunch hour." "Professor Winters told me you're entitled to one," David said with a conspiratorial smile. "I checked before coming over. He said, and I quote, 'Margaret works too hard. Tell her to go enjoy a decent meal for once.'" I laughed, both at David's initiative and at Professor Winters' characteristic bluntness. In that case, how can I refuse? The cafe was indeed new, a small, cheerful place with hanging plants in the windows and a menu that featured organic ingredients, which was somewhat revolutionary for Lakeshire in 1974. We found a table by the window, and over sandwiches that lived up to their reputation, our conversation flowed as easily as it had at the gala. David told me about growing up in Boston, the son of an architect father and a pianist mother. He spoke of his years at Brown and Columbia, of his passion for American history, particularly the overlooked stories of ordinary people who had shaped the nation in small but significant ways. "That's why I was so interested when the position in Lakeshire opened up," he explained. "Small towns like this, with their preserved architecture and long-standing families, they're living museums in a way. Each building, each family name has a story behind it." "Is that why you asked about Oakridge?" I inquired, remembering my mother's invitation. "Partly," David admitted. "I'd heard about the house even before I moved here. It's mentioned in several books on New England Victorian architecture, but mostly—" He paused, adjusting his glasses in what I would come to recognize as a nervous gesture. "I asked because I wanted an excuse to see you again." The directness of his statement caught me off guard. In Lakeshire's social circle, interest was typically expressed through elaborate rituals of hints and suggestions, often mediated by third parties. David's straightforward approach was refreshing, but also slightly alarming. "Oh," was all I managed to say. David's face fell slightly. "I'm sorry if that was too forward. I've been told I can be a bit direct sometimes." No, I hastened to reassure him. "It's not that. I'm just not used to— people here tend to be more circumspect," he supplied with a small smile. "Exactly. Would you prefer if I went through proper channels? Perhaps I should speak with your father first, or have my department chair approach your family with a formal introduction?" His teasing tone made me laugh. "God, no. Please don't. My parents would immediately start planning the wedding." As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. What if he thought I was hinting at marriage after one lunch? But David merely chuckled. "Well, we wouldn't want that. At least not until the second date." And just like that, with a joke and a shared smile, we had acknowledged that this lunch was more than a casual meeting between acquaintances. It was the beginning of something, though what exactly, neither of us could yet say. That lunch was followed by others, and soon we established a routine of meeting once or twice a week, either at the cafe or at a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town. We were careful to keep our meetings casual and public, aware of the small-town gossip mill that would inevitably begin churning if we appeared too intimate. Not that there was anything particularly scandalous about our relationship. We talked, we laughed, we discovered shared interests in literature, architecture, and music. Occasionally, our hands would brush as we reached for the salt, or he held a door open for me, and the brief contact would send a charge through me that was both thrilling and terrifying. I didn't tell my parents about these meetings. I told myself it was because there was nothing to tell. We were just colleagues sharing lunch, but in truth, I knew they would disapprove. David was not from their world, not part of the established Lakeshore society they valued so highly. More importantly, any serious relationship would threaten my role as Oakridge's caretaker, a role they had carefully cultivated for me since childhood. But as spring turned to summer, it became increasingly difficult to pretend that David and I were just friends. Our conversations grew deeper, more personal. He told me about his brief, failed marriage during graduate school to a fellow student who had ultimately chosen a career in Washington over their relationship. I shared stories of my childhood at Oakridge, of my abandoned dreams of becoming an architect, of the subtle pressures that had shaped my choices. "You could still do it, you know," David said one afternoon as we walked through the college's botanic gardens after lunch. "Apply to graduate programs in architecture. It's not too late." I shook my head, smiling sadly. It is too late, though. I have responsibilities at Oakridge. My parents rely on me. I can't just leave. David stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. "Margaret, you're 23 years old. Your entire life is ahead of you. Your parents are still active, healthy people. They could hire someone to help maintain the house if they needed to." "You don't understand," I said, my voice tight with emotions I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge. "Oakridge isn't just a house to my family. It's our identity. It's who we are. And I promised my father that I would take care of it." "When? When did you make this promise?" "On my 12th birthday," I admitted, realizing as I said it how absurd it sounded that a promise extracted from a child could dictate the course of an adult's life. David's expression softened. "Margaret, no reasonable person would hold a 12-year-old to such a promise. Your father asked that of you before you even knew who you were or what you wanted from life." "But I know now," I insisted, though even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. "Oakridge needs me." "And what about what you need?" David asked gently. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "What about the life you want to build for yourself?" I looked down at our joined hands, feeling a surge of something that might have been hope or might have been terror. "I don't know what I want anymore," I confessed. "I've spent so long thinking about what Oakridge needs, what my parents need, that I'm not sure I remember how to want things for myself." David's free hand came up to tilt my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. "Maybe it's time to start remembering," he said softly. And then, with a gentleness that brought tears to my eyes, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against mine in our first kiss. It was a brief kiss, chaste by any standard, but it shook me to my core. In that moment, standing amidst the college's meticulously maintained gardens, I felt a crack form in the carefully constructed edifice of duty and obligation that had defined my life. Through that crack, I glimpsed a different future, one that included David and architecture and a life beyond Oakridge's imposing walls. Here's the continuation of your story. "I worked 40 years for my family. They sold the family home without telling me." Continued. Chapter 3. The Choice. That kiss in the botanical garden marked a turning point. For the first time since returning, To Oak Ridge after college, I began to seriously consider a different path for my life. David had awakened something in me, not just romantic feelings, but a sense of possibility that had long been dormant. Over the weeks that followed, our relationship deepened. We were careful, always meeting away from prying Lakeshore eyes, but there was no denying that what had begun as friendly lunches had blossomed into something much more significant. One evening in late August, David invited me to dinner at his home on Maple Street. It was the first time we'd met somewhere truly private, and I felt both nervous and exhilarated as I parked my car a block away, a precaution against gossip, and walked to his house. The house itself was modest by Whitaker standards, a charming craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and simple, clean lines. David greeted me at the door with a kiss and ushered me inside. "I hope you like Italian," he said, leading me through to a small dining room where the table was already set, a bottle of wine breathing beside 2 glasses. "I love it," I replied, touched by the effort he had clearly put into the evening. Our house smelled of garlic and herbs, and classical music played softly from speakers in the living room. Over homemade pasta and a second glass of wine, I found myself relaxing in a way I rarely did at Oak Ridge, where meals were still formal affairs with proper place settings and carefully observed etiquette. "Tell me something," David said as he refilled our glasses. "If you could do anything at all, with no constraints or obligations, what would it be?" I considered the question carefully. It had been so long since I'd allowed myself to think in those terms. "I'd apply to graduate school," I finally said. "For architecture. I'd design spaces that make people feel at home. Not grand, imposing. Spaces like Oak Ridge, but places where people can truly live and breathe and be themselves." David nodded, watching me with an intensity that made my cheeks warm. "And where would you live while studying? Where would you make your home?" The question carried weight, and we both knew it. "I don't know," I admitted. "Not Oak Ridge. Somewhere new. Somewhere mine. Somewhere ours, perhaps," David suggested quietly, reaching across the table to take my hand. My heart seemed to stop, for a moment, then resume at double speed. "David, are you—" "I'm not proposing. Not yet," he clarified with a small smile. "But I am asking you to consider a future with me in it. A future where you pursue your dreams and I pursue mine, and we do it together." "My parents would never accept it," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't an outright refusal. "They might surprise you," David said, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. "But even if they don't, Margaret, you have to live your own life. You can't be the custodian of their house and their traditions forever." I stared down at our joined hands, feeling the weight of generations of Whitakers pressing down on me. I wouldn't know how to tell them. They've always assumed I'd stay at Oak Ridge, that I'd be there to take care of things. "Your brother will inherit the house anyway, won't he? Let him worry about its upkeep." I laughed bitterly. "Albert, he hasn't so much as changed a light bulb at Oak Ridge since he left for college. And Catherine—" I trailed off, thinking of my future sister-in-laws, manicured hands and designer clothes. Well, let's just say I can't picture her climbing ladders to clean gutters or negotiating with plumbers. "Then they'll have to hire people, like most homeowners do," David said reasonably. "The point is, Margaret, it's not your responsibility. It never should have been." I wanted desperately to believe him, to embrace the future he was offering, a future of my own choosing, with a man who valued me for myself, not for my usefulness as Oak Ridge's caretaker. But decades of conditioning couldn't be overcome in a single evening. "I need time," I finally said, "to think, to figure out how to talk to my parents." David nodded, squeezing my hand reassuringly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom at Oak Ridge, the same room I'd slept in for over 20 years, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a life away from these walls. It was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Oak Ridge had been my constant, my anchor in a changing world. The idea of leaving it behind felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing if I would fly or fall. The next morning, I came downstairs to find my father in his study, reading the newspaper with his customary cup of black coffee. "Father," I said, hovering in the doorway, "do you have a moment?" He looked up, his expression mildly surprised. I rarely sought him out for conversation. Our interactions typically limited to practical matters about the house or social obligations. "Of course, Margaret. Come in." I sat in the same chair where I had sat on my 12th birthday, when he had first spoken to me about my duty to Oak Ridge. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. "I've been thinking," I began cautiously, "about my future." My father folded his newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention. "Oh, in what respect?" "I'm considering applying to graduate school. For architecture." There was a moment of silence as my father absorbed this information. His face remained impassive, but I could see the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled disapproval. "I see," he said finally. "And what has prompted this consideration?" I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, but now that I was actually having it, all my carefully prepared explanations seemed inadequate. "I've always been interested in architecture, Father. You know that. It's why I love Oak Ridge so much. The design, the craftsmanship. I think I could be good at it. I think it's what I'm meant to do." My father studied me for a long moment. "And what about your responsibilities here? Who would maintain Oak Ridge while you're off pursuing this interest of yours?" The way he said interest, as if architecture were a fleeting hobby rather than a profound calling, stung. "I'm not suggesting abandoning Oak Ridge entirely," I said, though that was precisely what I had been considering. "But perhaps it's time to think about other arrangements. Professional caretakers or—" "Professional caretakers?" my father interrupted, his tone incredulous. "Strangers, you mean? People with no connection to this house, no understanding of its history or its significance? They would be trained professionals, Father. People who know how to maintain historical properties. That's not the point, Margaret." My father's voice had taken on the stern quality I remembered from childhood reprimands. "Oak Ridge isn't just a historical property. It's our home, our heritage. It requires someone who cares for it, not just someone who knows how to fix a leaky faucet." I felt my resolve wavering under his disapproval. "I do care for it, Father. I always will. But I also need to care for myself, to build a life that's—" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "That's mine." "And your life here isn't yours?" he asked, gesturing broadly to encompass not just the study, but Oak Ridge as a whole. "Everything we've given you, everything we've built for you. That's not enough?" The conversation was going exactly as I had feared. My father couldn't or wouldn't understand that what he saw as a gift, I had come to see as a burden. That the very things he considered to be expressions of love felt to me like chains binding me to a life I hadn't chosen. "It's not about enough," I tried to explain. "It's about choice, about being able to pursue my own dreams, to make my own mistakes." "Dreams," my father repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. "Margaret, life isn't about chasing dreams. It's about fulfilling obligations, honoring commitments. You made a promise to this family, to this house." I was 12. The words burst from me with more force than I had intended. I didn't understand what I was promising. My father seemed taken aback by my outburst, but he recovered quickly. "You understood perfectly well. You promised to care for Oak Ridge, to help maintain our family's legacy. And now what? You want to renege on that promise because of some infatuation with buildings?" "It's not an infatuation," I insisted, struggling to keep my voice level. It's what I want to do with my life. And yes, I made a promise, but I've also spent the last 10 years keeping it. I've put Oak Ridge first in every decision I've made. I went to Wellesley instead of RISD. I came back here after graduation instead of pursuing a career. I've repaired and cleaned and maintained every inch of this house. Doesn't that count for anything? My father's expression softened marginally. Of course it counts, Margaret. Your mother and I are deeply appreciative of everything you've done for Oak Ridge. But that doesn't change the fact that the house needs ongoing care. Albert will inherit it eventually, yes, but he has his career to focus on. Catherine will have the children and her social obligations. Who will look after Oak Ridge if not you? And there it was, laid bare, the true reason for my parents' insistence that I remain at Oak Ridge. Not because they needed me personally, but because the house needed a caretaker, and I was the only Whitaker without more important responsibilities. Perhaps, I suggested, my voice tight with the effort of controlling my emotions. It's time to consider whether maintaining Oak Ridge in its current state is even practical anymore. The taxes alone eat up a significant portion of your pension, Father. Maybe a smaller property would be more manageable for all of us. From my father's expression, you would have thought I had suggested burning Oak Ridge to the ground. Sell Oak Ridge? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret, this house has been in our family for 5 generations. Your great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands. How could you even suggest such a thing? Great-great-grandfather had servants, I pointed out. A full staff to maintain the house. We have me. And I'm telling you, Father, that I can't do it alone forever. My father stood abruptly, signaling that the conversation was over. I think you need to reconsider what you're suggesting, Margaret. This talk of graduate school, of selling Oak Ridge, it's nonsense. You're upset about something, clearly. Perhaps this administrative job at the college is more stressful than you've let on. This isn't about my job, I began, but he held up a hand to silence me. We'll speak no more of this today. I suggest you take some time to reflect on your priorities and responsibilities. With that, he picked up his newspaper and left the study, leaving me alone with the distinct feeling that I had just shattered something irreparable. I remained in the chair for several minutes, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. The conversation had gone even worse than I had anticipated. My father hadn't just disagreed with my plans, he had dismissed them entirely, treating me like a wayward child rather than an adult with legitimate aspirations. When I finally left the study, I found my mother waiting in the hallway, her face drawn with concern. I couldn't help overhearing, she said softly. Your father is upset. I noticed, I replied dryly, brushing past her toward the stairs. Margaret, wait. My mother caught my arm, her grip surprisingly firm. This sudden interest in architecture school, it wouldn't have anything to do with that young history professor, would it? David Mitchell? I froze, then turned slowly to face her. How did you know about David? My mother's smile was sad and knowing. Lakeshire is a small town, dear. People talk. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter works at that little cafe on Main Street. She's seen you there with him, quite regularly, apparently. I felt a flush of embarrassment and anger, all our careful precautions, and still, Lakeshire's gossip mill had ground on. So what if it does? I challenged. David believes in me. He thinks I could be a good architect. I'm sure he does, dear. Men often say such things when they're interested in a woman. The implication was clear. David was merely flattering me to win my affections. That's not how it is, I insisted. David respects me. He values my opinions and my talents. He wants me to pursue my dreams. And conveniently, those dreams would take you away from Oak Ridge, away from your family, and toward him. My mother's voice was gentle but unyielding. Margaret, I'm not saying he's a bad man, but you must consider his motivations. He's new to town, clearly ambitious. An association with the Whitaker family would be beneficial for his career and social standing. You think he's using me? I asked incredulously. Because of the Whitaker name? I think, my mother said carefully, that young men often have complicated motivations. And I think that you, having lived a somewhat sheltered life, might not always recognize them. I pulled my arm free of her grasp, anger burning through me. I'm not a child, Mother. I'm 23 years old. I'm perfectly capable of judging someone's character for myself. Of course you are, dear, she said in that placating tone she used when she didn't believe a word I was saying. Just promise me you'll be careful, and that you'll reconsider this architecture school idea. Your father is genuinely upset. He sees it as a rejection of everything he's tried to give you. It's not a rejection, I said tiredly. It's just, I need something that's mine. Something I've chosen for myself. My mother's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I understand that feeling, Margaret. More than you know. But sometimes the choices we think we want aren't really the right ones for us. Sometimes the path that's laid out before us, even if it wasn't our first choice, turns out to be the one that leads to true happiness. I wondered if she was speaking from experience, if she had once harbored dreams that she had set aside for the sake of my father in Oak Ridge. The thought made me unbearably sad. I need to think, I said, turning again toward the stairs. I need some time alone. My mother nodded, releasing me. Of course, dear. Just remember that everything your father and I have done, everything we've asked of you has been out of love. We only want what's best for you. I climbed the stairs to my room, her words echoing in my head. What's best for you? That phrase had been the justification for so many decisions made on my behalf throughout my life. What's best for you is to go to Wellesley, not RISD. What's best for you is to come home after graduation. What's best for you is to dedicate your life to a house you'll never own. And perhaps the most painful realization, my parents genuinely believed it. They weren't deliberately stifling my dreams or trapping me at Oak Ridge out of selfishness or malice. They truly, deeply believed that the path they had chosen for me was the one that would lead to my happiness and fulfillment. How could I make them understand that they were wrong? I spent the rest of the day in my room, emerging only for dinner, which was a silent, tense affair. My father buried himself in his newspaper. My mother made a few half-hearted attempts at conversation, and I pushed food around my plate without really eating. After dinner, I waited until my parents were settled in the living room, my father with his book, my mother with her knitting, before slipping out to use the telephone in the hallway. I dialed David's number, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Hello? His voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. It's me, I said softly, conscious of my parents in the next room. Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk to you. Of course. Is everything all right? You sound upset. I'll explain tomorrow. The park bench by the lake, around noon? I'll be there, he promised. Margaret, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Those words, so simple, yet so profound in their implication of partnership and shared burdens, nearly brought me to tears. Thank you, I whispered, and hung up before the emotion in my voice could betray me. The next day dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect late summer days that hint at the approaching autumn. I told my parents I was going into town to run errands, which wasn't entirely a lie. I did stop at the post office and the pharmacy before making my way to the small park on the shores of Lake Champlain. David was already there when I arrived, sitting on our usual bench with a brown paper bag beside him. He stood as I approached, his face lighting up with a smile that faltered as he noted my expression. That bad, huh? He asked as I sat down beside him. Worse, I admitted, and proceeded to recount my conversation with my father and the subsequent exchange with my mother. David listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly troubled. "So they basically think I'm some sort of fortune hunter, using you to climb the Lakeshire social ladder," he said when I finished. "My mother does, at least." My father didn't even get that far. He was too upset about the mere suggestion that I might leave Oakridge. David sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Margaret, I hate to say this, but your parents' attitude is, well, it's controlling. Unhealthily so. You're an adult woman with every right to pursue education and a career of your choosing." "I know that," I said. "Intellectually, I know it. But when I'm facing them, when they're looking at me with disappointment and hurt, it's like I'm 12 years old again, desperate to please them." David took my hand, his expression earnest. "Then maybe you need some distance, some space to figure out what you really want, away from their influence." "What are you suggesting?" "Come stay with me," he said simply. "Just for a while. Apply to graduate programs. See what happens. If you get accepted, great. If not, at least you will have tried." The offer was tempting, so tempting that it terrified me. To leave Oakridge, to move in with David, to apply to architecture schools. It would be burning bridges I wasn't sure I could ever rebuild. "I can't just leave," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Oakridge is my home. My parents, for all their flaws, are my family." "And they'll still be your family if you move a few blocks away," David pointed out gently. "This isn't about cutting ties, Margaret. It's about establishing boundaries, about claiming your independence." I stared out at the lake, watching the sunlight dance on its surface. The idea of independence was both exhilarating and terrifying. For my entire life, I had been defined by my relationship to Oakridge and the Whitaker name. Who would I be without them? "I need more time," I finally said. "To think. To plan. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it right." David nodded, though I could sense his disappointment. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Just don't let them talk you out of your dreams, Margaret. Don't settle for less than the life you want." I squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. "I won't. I promise." But as I walked back to Oakridge that afternoon, I wondered if that was a promise I could keep. The weight of family expectations, of duty and tradition, pressed down on me with each step closer to the imposing Victorian mansion that had been both my home and my cage for as long as I could remember. The next few weeks were a strange, tense time at Oakridge. My parents and I engaged in a kind of emotional Cold War, each of us careful to maintain the appearance of normalcy while avoiding any mention of architecture school, David, or my future. I continued my administrative job at the college, continued maintaining Oakridge, continued playing the role of the dutiful daughter. But beneath the surface, things had irrevocably changed. I had spoken aloud my desire for a different life, and though my parents might hope I would forget it, I could not. The seed had been planted long ago, when I first dreamed of becoming an architect, and David had helped it take root and grow. I continued to see David, though we were more cautious than ever. We met in nearby towns rather than in Lakeshire, checking into small inns under his name only, spending precious hours talking and planning and loving away from the watchful eyes of my parents and the town gossips. In October, with David's encouragement, I sent applications to 3 graduate programs in architecture: Columbia, Yale, and RISD. I used David's address for all correspondence, afraid that my parents might intercept any letters that came to Oakridge. The waiting was excruciating. Every day I expected my parents to confront me, to reveal that they had somehow discovered my applications. But October turned to November, and November to December, and still our uneasy peace held. "All the connections to who we are as Whitakers. Gone," my father continued, his voice cracking with emotion. Is that what you want? To be the generation that lets it all slip away? I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. The weight of his request, no, his expectation, settled heavily on my shoulders. It was the same weight I had carried throughout my childhood and young adulthood, the burden of family legacy and obligation. Father, I said carefully, I need time to think about this, to discuss it with David. This isn't a decision I can make on my own or in a single afternoon. He nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was clear. Of course. But don't take too long, Margaret. My time is limited, and I need to make arrangements for Oak Ridge one way or another. I understand, I said, rising from the chair. I'll give it serious consideration, I promise. As I turned to leave, my father called my name once more. I looked back to find him staring at me with an intensity that reminded me of the imposing man he had once been. Whatever you decide, he said softly, know that I am proud of what you've accomplished, Margaret. Your mother has shown me articles about your work, buildings you've restored. You've done well for yourself, despite our differences. The unexpected praise caught me off guard, bringing a lump to my throat. Thank you, Father, I managed, and quickly left the study before he could see the tears that threatened to spill. That evening, dinner at Oak Ridge was a tense affair. Albert, Catherine, my mother and I sat around the dining table that had hosted Whitaker family meals for generations. My father had begged off, claiming fatigue, though I suspected he was avoiding the potential conflict that simmered beneath the surface of our polite conversation. Catherine was exactly as I remembered her, pretty in a conventional way, impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite though lacking warmth. She asked appropriate questions about my career and life in Chicago, listening with practiced interest to my responses. Albert, on the other hand, barely concealed his resentment. He drank too much wine and made pointed comments about people who abandon their family responsibilities that were clearly directed at me, though never explicit enough for my mother to call him out on it. I understand Father spoke to you about Oak Ridge, he said finally as Mrs. Sullivan cleared the dinner plates and brought in dessert, a lemon tart that had been my favorite as a child. I nodded, aware of my mother and Catherine exchanging glances. He did. And, Albert prompted, refilling his wine glass. What did you tell him? That I need time to consider it, I replied evenly. It's not a simple decision. Albert laughed, a short, humorless sound. Isn't it? You left Oak Ridge behind a decade ago, made it very clear that this house and all it represents wasn't part of the future you wanted. Why would that have changed? Albert, my mother warned, but he waved her off. No, Mother, let's be honest for once. Margaret abandoned her responsibilities to this family years ago. She chose her own path, her own life. Which was her right, he added quickly, raising his glass in a mock toast to me. But now that Father is dying, now that there are decisions to be made about Oak Ridge, suddenly she's interested again? That's unfair, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. I came because Father asked me to, because he's ill and wanted to see me, not because I have designs on Oak Ridge. And yet he's offering it to you, Albert said, his eyes hard. After all these years of assuming it would come to me, now that I've made other arrangements for my family, he suddenly decides you should have it. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I didn't ask for this, I retorted. If anything, I'm as surprised as you are. Catherine laid a hand on Albert's arm, a gesture clearly meant to calm him. What Albert means, she said in her carefully modulated voice, is that we've made our plans with the understanding that Oak Ridge would be sold. We've invested in our new home, enrolled the children in schools nearby. It would be difficult to adjust those plans now. I looked between them, understanding dawning. You're counting on the money from selling Oak Ridge, aren't you? That's why you're so adamant about not keeping it in the family. Albert's face flushed, confirming my suspicion. The maintenance costs alone are astronomical, as you well know. The property taxes, the repairs, the staff. It's a financial drain that makes no sense in today's world. Selling Oak Ridge is the practical solution? Practical, I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. That's the same word Father used. He said you wanted to liquidate the asset. Because that's what it is, Albert insisted, his voice rising. A valuable piece of real estate that's costing more to maintain than it's worth sentimentally. We're not living in the 1880s anymore, Margaret. The days of grand family estates are over. That's enough, Albert, my mother interjected firmly. This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. Your father is upstairs unwell, and we have more immediate concerns than the future of Oak Ridge. Albert subsided, though the resentment still simmered in his eyes. Catherine smoothly changed the subject to her children's school activities, and the rest of the meal passed in strained conversation about safer topics. Later that night, I called David from the telephone in the hallway, keeping my voice low to avoid being overheard. It's a complete mess, I told him after explaining my father's offer and Albert's reaction. Father is dying and wants me to take Oak Ridge to prevent Albert from selling it. Albert needs the money from selling Oak Ridge and resents the very suggestion that I might interfere with those plans, and I'm caught in the middle of a decision I never asked to make. What do you want? David asked, his voice a comforting presence, despite the miles between us. Setting aside what your father wants and what Albert wants, what would make you happy, Margaret? I sighed, twisting the telephone cord around my finger as I had done as a teenager. I don't know. Part of me is moved by Father's offer, by his acknowledgement, finally, that I have a connection to Oak Ridge that's valuable. But another part remembers how suffocating it was to live here, how this house became a cage rather than a home. Could we make it work if you wanted to accept? David mused. I could inquire about positions at the college. You could open your own practice specializing in historical restoration. Lakeshore isn't Chicago, but it has its charms. The fact that he was willing to even consider such a drastic change for my sake made my heart swell with love for him. You would do that? Uproot your life, leave your research and colleagues, move back to a small town where you're still remembered as the man who stole the Whitaker daughter away? David chuckled. I'd wear that title with pride. But seriously, Margaret, if this is something you want, we can make it work. We've built a good life in Chicago, but we could build another one in Lakeshore if that's what you decide. I need to think, I said, gratitude for his understanding warring with the confusion I felt about the whole situation. I'll call you tomorrow, after I've had a chance to talk more with Father and see the full picture. After hanging up, I made my way slowly up the grand staircase of Oak Ridge, my fingers trailing along the polished wooden banister that had supported generations of Whitakers as they ascended to the upper floors. Despite everything, there was a comfort in the familiar creaks of the stairs, in the way the moonlight filtered through the stained glass window on the landing, casting colorful shadows across the carpet runner. This house knew me in a way few other places did. It had witnessed my childhood joys and sorrows, my adolescent rebellions, my adult decisions. In its bones and timbers, Oak Ridge held the story of who I had been, even as I had grown into someone else far away from its walls. Could I reconcile those two parts of myself? The Margaret who had fled Oak Ridge to pursue her own dreams, and the Margaret who still felt connected to this place, who understood its value beyond the financial implications Albert saw. I didn't have an answer as I slipped into my childhood bedroom and lay down beneath the familiar weight of the old quilt. But as I drifted off to sleep, the house seemed to settle around me, creaking and sighing like a living thing, welcoming me back into its embrace despite the years of absence. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore Oak Ridge properly, to see for myself what condition the house was in after nearly a decade away. I moved quietly through the hallways, not wanting to wake the others, noting what had changed and what remained the same. The physical structure of Oak Ridge was largely as I remembered it, but there were signs of neglect that would have been unthinkable during my time as its caretaker. Water stains discolored the ceiling in the East Wing corridor. Several of the ornate cornices in the formal dining room showed cracks that had been inexpertly filled. The grand staircase's banister wobbled slightly under my hand, suggesting loose fittings that needed tightening. Outside, the gardens that had been my mother's pride showed similar signs of decline. The rose bushes were overgrown, the hedges untrimmed, the gravel paths choked with weeds in places. The greenhouse where she had once nurtured exotic plants had several broken panes, with temporary plastic sheeting serving as a makeshift repair. The boathouse by the small lake on the property had fared even worse. Its wooden dock was rotting in places, with several planks missing entirely. The boathouse itself leaned noticeably to one side, its foundation clearly compromised by years of exposure to the elements without proper maintenance. As I completed my inspection, I calculated the costs of bringing Oak Ridge back to its former glory. It would be substantial, hundreds of thousands at a minimum, potentially crossing into seven figures for a full restoration. No wonder Albert wanted to sell. The financial burden of Oak Ridge had become untenable for a family no longer possessed of the wealth that had built it. I found my father in the morning room, a small, sun-filled space off the main parlor where the family had traditionally taken breakfast. He was alone, seated in his wheelchair by the window, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. "You're up early," he observed as I entered. "I hope you slept well." "I did," I replied, taking the chair opposite him. "I've been looking around the house and grounds. Things have deteriorated since I was last here." My father sighed, his gaze drifting to the window and the overgrown gardens beyond. "Yes. Well, neither your mother nor I are as spry as we once were. Mrs. Sullivan does her best, but she's getting on in years herself. And the younger help we've hired, they don't have the same commitment to Oak Ridge that you did. It's just a job to them, not a calling." The compliment, if that's what it was, struck me as both gratifying and disturbing. Had my father always seen my dedication to Oak Ridge as a calling, rather than the result of pressure and expectation? "It would take significant investment to restore Oak Ridge properly," I said carefully. "The structure is sound, but there are issues that will only worsen if not addressed soon." "I'm aware," my father admitted, turning back to me. "Which is why I understand Albert's position, even if I don't agree with it. The financial burden of Oak Ridge is considerable. But surely that's something your expertise could help address? Finding grants for historical preservation, perhaps?" I nodded slowly. "It's possible. There are programs for houses of historical significance, but they wouldn't cover everything, and they often come with restrictions on how the property can be used or modified. Better than losing it entirely," my father said firmly. "Margaret, I know I'm asking a lot. I know you've built a life elsewhere, a successful one. But please consider what I'm offering. Oak Ridge would be yours, not just to maintain, but to own, to shape according to your vision, while respecting its heritage." The significance of what he was saying hit me fully for the first time. My father wasn't just asking me to prevent Albert from selling Oak Ridge. He was offering to leave it to me in his will, breaking with generations of tradition that had passed the family home to the eldest son. "Why me?" I asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at me since our conversation the previous day. "Why not Albert, as you always planned?" My father's expression clouded. "Albert sees Oak Ridge as a liability, an outdated relic that's outlived its usefulness. He's a practical man, your brother. Always has been. He values what Oak Ridge represents in terms of family status, but not the house itself." He shook his head slightly. "Perhaps that's my failure as a father, not instilling in him the same appreciation for history and tradition that you seem to have absorbed naturally. Or perhaps he simply has different values," I suggested gently. different priorities for his life and for his children's future. Perhaps, my father conceded, though his tone suggested he considered those priorities misguided. But you, Margaret, you've always understood Oakridge in a way Albert never did. Even when you left, even when you pursued your own path, you took with you an appreciation for what this house represents. Your work in architectural preservation proves that. It was true, in a way I had never fully acknowledged to myself. My career choice hadn't been a complete rejection of my upbringing. It had been a transformation of the values I had been taught, redirected toward a broader purpose. I preserved historical buildings not out of blind adherence to tradition, but out of respect for the stories they contained, the craftsmanship they showcased, the connections they forged between past and present. I need to know something, Father, I said, meeting his gaze directly. If I were to accept your offer, if I were to take on Oakridge, would it come with the same expectations that burdened me as a child? Would I be expected to maintain it exactly as it has always been, to live my life in service to this house rather than making it serve the life I want to live? My father seemed taken aback by the directness of my question. He was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his wheelchair as he considered his response. I won't deny that I have preferences about how Oakridge should be maintained, he said finally. But if you're asking whether I would try to control how you manage the property from beyond the grave, the answer is no. Oakridge would be yours, Margaret, truly yours, to care for in whatever way you see fit. It was the answer I had hoped for, but hadn't entirely expected. And what about your expectations for my personal life? For my marriage? A flash of discomfort crossed his face. Your husband, David, he would be welcome here, of course. I may have misjudged him in the past. What changed your mind? I asked, genuinely curious. My father smiled faintly. Your mother. She's shown me articles about your work over the years, kept track of your career. It's clear that you've flourished in your marriage, that David has supported your professional growth rather than hindering it. That suggests a man of character, whatever his background or connections. It was as close to an approval of my choice of husband as I was likely to get, and it meant more than I had expected it to. Thank you for saying that, I said softly. My father nodded, then leaned forward in his wheelchair, his expression intense. I won't pretend that taking on Oakridge would be easy, Margaret. It would require sacrifices, adjustments to the life you've built. But it would also offer opportunities, a chance to apply your professional skills to a property with deep personal meaning, a chance to redefine what Oakridge represents for future generations of Whitakers. The vision he painted was compelling. I could see it in my mind's eye. Oakridge, restored to its former glory but modernized in subtle ways, made more functional, more sustainable. Perhaps parts of it open to the public for architectural tours or educational programs. The grounds revitalized with gardens that honored my mother's designs while incorporating contemporary landscape architecture principles. It would be a project worthy of my skills, a chance to reconcile my past and present in a meaningful way. But it would also mean leaving Chicago, the firm I had helped build, the network of colleagues and friends David and I had established there. It would mean returning to Lakeshire, with all its small-town limitations and memories both good and painful. I need to see the will, I said abruptly. The legal details of what you're proposing, and I need to talk with Albert about this directly, not through veiled comments at dinner. If I'm to consider your offer seriously, I need complete transparency about what it entails. My father seemed surprised by my businesslike approach, but he nodded after a moment. Of course. I'll have Mr. Harrington, my attorney, come by this afternoon with the draft documents. As for Albert, he grimaced slightly. That conversation may be more difficult, but you're right that it needs to happen. Perhaps after breakfast? I agreed. And as if on cue, My mother appeared in the doorway of the morning room, looking tired but composed in a simple blue dress that had seen better days. "I thought I heard voices," she said, coming to join us. "You're both up early." "Just catching up," my father replied, reaching for her hand as she approached his wheelchair. "Margaret has been inspecting Oakridge with her professional eye." My mother's smile was tinged with sadness. "And found it wanting, I'm sure. We haven't been able to maintain it as you once did, Margaret." "It's still beautiful," I assured her. "The core structure is sound. The issues I noticed are all fixable." "For a price?" she said with a sigh. "Everything about Oakridge comes with a price, doesn't it? Not just in dollars, but in time, in energy, in choices foregone." The wistfulness in her voice caught me by surprise. I had always assumed my mother was as devoted to Oakridge as my father, as committed to preserving it at all costs. But her comment suggested a more complicated relationship with the house than I had realized. "Do you think Father is right?" I asked her directly. "That I should take on Oakridge, prevent it from being sold?" She looked startled by the question, glancing quickly at my father before responding. I think Oakridge has shaped all our lives, for better and worse. It's given us a sense of permanence, of connection to the past. But it's also demanded sacrifices that perhaps weren't always fairly distributed." She squeezed my father's hand before continuing. "I would hate to see it sold to strangers, but I would hate even more to see you sacrifice your happiness for it, as I sometimes fear I did." It was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me about her own life, and it hit me with the force of revelation. Had she harbored dreams that Oakridge had smothered? Had she made choices she regretted for the sake of tradition and family expectations? "Eleanor," my father began, his tone suggesting he was about to contradict her, but she silenced him with a gentle touch to his shoulder. "Thomas, let's be honest with ourselves and with Margaret. Oakridge has been the center of our world for so long that we've sometimes forgotten there are other ways to live, other values to honor. If Margaret chooses to take on this house, it should be with open eyes and a clear understanding of what it will require of her." My mother turned back to me, her expression more open and vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "Whatever you decide, Margaret, your father and I will respect your choice. We've learned, perhaps too late, that trying to dictate your path leads only to estrangement. We don't want to lose you again." Her words brought tears to my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I had come to Oakridge prepared for manipulation, for guilt, for the subtle pressure that had characterized so much of my upbringing. I hadn't been prepared for this honesty, this acknowledgement of past mistakes. "Thank you," I managed, blinking back the tears. "That means more than you know." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan announcing that breakfast was ready in the dining room. As we made our way there, my father in his wheelchair, my mother and I walking alongside, I felt a shift in the dynamic between us. We weren't quite equals, not yet, but there was a new respect in their treatment of me, an acknowledgement of my autonomy that had been missing in the past. Albert and Catherine joined us for breakfast, along with their children, my niece and nephew, whom I was meeting for the first time. Thomas was indeed a little gentleman, as my mother had described, carefully using his napkin and saying please and thank you with practiced precision. Elizabeth was a chubby-cheeked toddler with Albert's dark hair and Catherine's delicate features, more interested in playing with her food than eating it. The presence of the children changed the tenor of the meal, making it impossible to discuss the serious matters that hung over us. Instead, we engaged in polite conversation about the weather, about the children's activities, about neutral topics that wouldn't disturb the fragile peace of the breakfast table. After the meal, as Catherine took the children upstairs for their morning nap, I approached Albert directly. "We need to talk," I said without preamble. "About Father's offer and what it means for both of us." Albert's expression hardened, but he nodded. "Yes, I suppose we do. The study." I followed him to the room that had been the site of so many significant conversations in my life. As Albert closed the door behind us, I was struck by the weight of history in this space. The generations of Whitakers who had made decisions within these walls that affected the family's future. "Let me be clear," Albert said as soon as we were alone, not bothering with pleasantries. "I have no interest in living at Oak Ridge. Catherine and I have built our own home, one that suits our needs and our vision for our family's future. But that doesn't mean I'm comfortable with Father simply giving it to you, after all these years of assuming it would come to me." "I didn't ask for it," I reminded him. "I came because Father is ill and wanted to see me, not because I had designs on Oak Ridge." "Perhaps not consciously," Albert allowed, pacing before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. "But you must have known that your sudden reappearance after a decade would stir things up. Father has always had a blind spot where you're concerned. A romanticized view of your connection to this house. The accusation stung, partly because there was a grain of truth to it. I had known that returning to Oak Ridge would be emotionally complicated for everyone involved. But I hadn't anticipated my father's offer or the conflict it would create with Albert. "What do you want, Albert?" I asked directly. "Clearly you don't want to live here. Do you just want the proceeds from selling it?" He stopped pacing, turning to face me with a flush of anger on his cheeks. "It's not just about the money, though, yes, that's a factor. The costs of maintaining Oak Ridge have been eating away at Father's retirement funds for years. The proceeds from selling it would help secure Mother's future after he's gone, provide for her care as she ages. It was a valid concern, one I hadn't fully considered. And if I were to take on Oak Ridge, those costs would become my responsibility?" "Exactly," Albert said, seemingly relieved that I understood. "The taxes, the maintenance, the staff, all of it would fall to you and your husband. Are you prepared for that financial burden?" "Is he?" I considered the question seriously. David and I were comfortable financially, but not wealthy by any means. Taking on Oak Ridge would strain our resources considerably, even with potential grants for historical preservation. "What if there were a compromise?" I suggested, an idea forming as I spoke. "What if I took ownership of Oak Ridge but established a trust to manage it? A portion of the house could be opened for public tours or educational programs, generating income to offset the maintenance costs. The rest would remain private, a family residence." Albert looked skeptical. "You're suggesting turning Oak Ridge into some sort of museum?" "Not exactly," I clarified. "More like a living example of Victorian architecture and lifestyle with controlled public access to certain areas. The main family spaces would remain private. It's a model that's worked for other historical homes of this size and significance." "And Mother? Where would she live after Father is gone?" "She could continue to live here, of course," I said, surprised he would even ask. "This is her home. Nothing would change in that regard." Albert considered this, his expression thoughtful for the first time since our conversation began. "It's an interesting proposal, but it would still require significant initial investment to restore Oak Ridge to a condition suitable for public viewing." "I'm aware," I acknowledged. "I would need to secure grants, possibly loans. It wouldn't be easy. But it might be a way to preserve Oak Ridge without it becoming a financial drain on any one family member." "And what about your career in Chicago? Your husband's position there? Would you move back to Lakeshore permanently, or try to manage Oak Ridge from a distance?" It was the question I had been asking myself since my father's offer. The practical details of how such an arrangement would work, what it would mean for the life David and I had built together. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "That's something David and I would need to discuss in detail, but architectural firms can open satellite offices. Colleges always need good history professors. It's not impossible to imagine a future where we split our time between Chicago and Lakeshore, at least initially." Albert nodded slowly, his initial hostility softening somewhat. I wouldn't be opposed to exploring your idea further. A trust, with clear parameters about how Oak Ridge would be managed and funded. It might be a solution that would satisfy Father's desire to keep the house in the family while addressing the practical financial concerns. Then you wouldn't object to Father changing his will to leave Oak Ridge to me under those conditions? I wouldn't object in principle, Albert said carefully. But I would want legal assurances about Mother's continued residence here, about how the trust would be structured, about what would happen if the venture proved financially unsustainable. Of course, I agreed readily. Complete transparency. On all sides. That's the only way this could work. For the first time since my arrival, Albert smiled. A small, cautious smile, but genuine nonetheless. You've changed, Margaret. The sister I remember wouldn't have approached this so pragmatically. 10 years in the professional world will do that, I replied, with a slight smile of my own. Architecture isn't just about aesthetics, it's about making spaces that work functionally and financially. Well, your practical approach is refreshing, Albert admitted. Let's see what Father's attorney has to say when he arrives. Perhaps there's a solution here that could work for all of us. As we left the study together, I felt a cautious hope beginning to grow. The idea of transforming Oak Ridge into a partially public historical site while maintaining its role as a family home appealed to both my professional instincts and my emotional connection to the house. It wouldn't be easy, but it might be a way to honor the past while creating a sustainable future for the Whitaker legacy. What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that this moment of tentative reconciliation with Albert was built on assumptions that would prove devastatingly false. That the seeds of a betrayal that would shatter our fragile peace had already been planted, waiting for the right moment to bear their bitter fruit. I worked 40 years for my family. They sold the family home without telling me, continued. Durstart. Chapter 6. The Compromise. Mr. Harrington, my father's attorney, arrived promptly at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He was a thin, serious man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a precise manner of speaking that suggested he measured every word before allowing it to leave his lips. I remembered him vaguely from my childhood. He had been handling the Whitaker family's legal matters for as long as I could recall. We gathered in the study, my father, Albert, Mr. Harrington, and myself. My mother chose not to attend, saying that legal discussions gave her a headache and that she trusted my father to handle such matters. Catherine was occupied with the children, which seemed convenient but may have been deliberate on Albert's part. I understand there has been some discussion about the disposition of Oak Ridge in your will, Professor Whitaker. Mr. Harrington began, addressing my father with the formal title he had earned during his years at the college. You indicated you might wish to make some changes to your existing arrangements. My father nodded, his hands folded in his lap, a picture of patrician dignity despite his illness. Yes. As I explained on the telephone, I am considering leaving Oak Ridge to my daughter Margaret, rather than to Albert as previously stipulated. Mr. Harrington's expression remained neutral, but I detected a slight lift of his eyebrows, the most surprise he would allow himself to display professionally. I see. And the reason for this change? Albert has expressed a desire to sell Oak Ridge after my death, my father replied, a hint of disapproval coloring his tone. I wish to ensure that the property remains in the family, that it continues to be the Whitaker family home as it has been for 5 generations. And you believe Ms. Whitaker would be more inclined to maintain the property? Mr. Harrington asked, glancing briefly in my direction. I believe Margaret has both the emotional connection to Oak Ridge and the professional expertise to preserve it properly, my father said firmly. Mr. Harrington nodded, making a note in the leather-bound portfolio he had brought with him. And what are your thoughts on this matter, Mr. Whitaker? He asked Albert. Albert cleared his throat, straightening in his chair. I have concerns about the financial viability of maintaining Oak Ridge as a private residence. The property taxes alone are substantial, not to mention the ongoing maintenance costs for a house of this age and size. However, he continued, glancing at me, Margaret has proposed an interesting compromise that might address these concerns. I took this as my cue and explained the idea I had suggested to Albert earlier, establishing a trust to manage Oak Ridge, opening portions of it to the public for tours and educational programs, while maintaining private family spaces. As I spoke, Mr. Harrington took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the structure of the proposed trust and how it would be funded. "This is certainly a creative solution," he said when I had finished. "It would require careful legal structuring, of course. There are tax implications to consider, zoning requirements for a property that would be partially commercial in nature, insurance considerations, all of which can be addressed with proper planning," I asserted. Historical homes throughout New England have successfully implemented similar models. With my background in architectural preservation, I believe I could secure grants and partnerships that would help offset the initial restoration costs. Mr. Harrington looked to my father. "And this compromise arrangement is acceptable to you, Professor Whitaker, opening Oak Ridge to public access, even in a limited capacity?" My father hesitated, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Oak Ridge had always been a private sanctuary for the Whitakers, a symbol of our families, separation from and elevation above the common residents of Lakeshore. The idea of strangers walking through its rooms, even under controlled conditions, would have been unthinkable to him a decade ago. "If it's the only way to preserve Oak Ridge, for future generations of Whitakers," he said finally, "then yes, it's acceptable. Better to share some of our heritage than to lose it entirely." "Very well," Mr. Harrington said, closing his portfolio. "I'll draft the necessary documents for your review. A revised will leaving Oak Ridge to Ms. Whitaker, and a separate trust. Document outlining the terms under which the property would be managed. I assume you would want certain provisions, ensuring Mrs. Whitaker's continued residence, for example, and specifying which portions of the house would remain private." "Yes, all of that," my father agreed, "and a stipulation that if Margaret were to predecease me, or if she were to decide at some point that she no longer wishes to maintain Oak Ridge according to these terms, the property would be offered to Albert before any consideration of selling it outside the family." I glanced at Albert, who nodded his agreement to this condition. It seemed fair, a recognition that circumstances might change, that the financial burden of Oak Ridge might prove too great despite our best intentions. "I'll have the documents ready for your review within the week," Mr. Harrington promised, rising to his feet. "Until then, I would advise all parties to continue discussions about the practical details of this arrangement. The more specific you can be about your mutual expectations, the stronger the legal framework I can create to support them." After Mr. Harrington left, the three of us remained in the study, a new and tentative accord established between us. For the first time since my arrival, I felt that a resolution might be possible, one that honored my father's wish to preserve Oak Ridge while respecting Albert's practical concerns and my own need for autonomy in how I would approach the property's future. "I should call David," I said, rising from my chair, "to discuss all this. He needs to be fully informed and on board if we're going to move forward with this plan." My father nodded, a hint of the old authority returning to his bearing. "Of course. Use the telephone in my study for privacy. Albert and I will continue to discuss the details of the trust arrangement." I left them to their conversation, grateful for the moment alone to gather my thoughts before speaking with David. The telephone call was brief but intense. I outlined my father's offer, Albert's concerns, and the compromise we had tentatively agreed upon. "It's a lot to take in," David said when I had finished. "Are you sure this is what you want, Margaret? Taking on Oak Ridge would be a massive commitment, even with the partial public access model you're describing." "I'm not completely sure," I admitted, "but the idea feels right. It would be a way to reconcile my past and present, to use my professional skills to preserve something that, despite everything, still matters to me. And it would give us options. We could maintain our base in Chicago, at least initially, and split our time between there and Lakeshire. I'm with you whatever you decide, David assured me. If this is the path you want to take, we'll make it work. Just make sure it's truly your choice this time, not a decision made out of obligation or guilt. His words stayed with me as I rejoined my father and Albert. Was I considering this compromise because it was genuinely what I wanted? Or was I, once again, being drawn into the orbit of family expectations and obligations? The difference this time, I realized, was that I was entering the situation with open eyes and clear boundaries. If I chose to take on Oak Ridge, it would be on terms that I had helped establish, with a vision for its future that aligned with my own values and skills. The remainder of the day was spent in detailed discussions about how the proposed trust would function, which parts of Oak Ridge might be open to the public, and what renovations would be necessary to make this arrangement viable. Albert, once he had accepted the basic premise, proved to be a valuable partner in these conversations. His legal background and attention to detail complemented my architectural knowledge, while my father contributed his deep understanding of Oak Ridge's history and significance. By evening, we had sketched out a rough blueprint for Oak Ridge's future. The first-floor public rooms would be open for guided tours 3 days a week. The library would host educational programs about Victorian architecture and lifestyle. The gardens would be restored with areas designated for public enjoyment and others reserved for family use. The upper floors, including all bedrooms and private family spaces, would remain closed to the public. My mother, when informed of our plans over dinner, seemed cautiously supportive. "It does seem like a sensible compromise," she said, though I detected a note of reservation in her voice. "And it would be lovely to see the gardens properly maintained again. They've suffered so in recent years." "I'd want your input on the garden restoration, Mother," I assured her. "No one knows those spaces better than you do." She smiled, touched by the acknowledgement. "I'd like that. There are some old planting plans in my desk that might be useful. Designs your grandmother created that I've tried to maintain over the years." As the evening wound down, there was a palpable sense of progress, of bridges being rebuilt between family members who had been estranged for far too long. Even Catherine, who had been coolly polite throughout my visit, seemed to warm slightly to the idea of Oak Ridge as a family heritage site, rather than simply a financial asset to be liquidated. I retired to my childhood bedroom that night with a mixture of emotions: hope for this new vision of Oak Ridge's future, apprehension about the practical challenges ahead, and a lingering caution born of my previous experiences with family expectations. But underlying it all was a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to honor my connection to Oak Ridge without sacrificing the independence I had fought so hard to establish. The next morning, I woke to the sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. I dressed quickly and made my way to the source of the commotion, my father's study, where I found him in his wheelchair facing Albert, both men red-faced with anger. "What's going on?" I asked, alarmed by the tension crackling between them. "Ask your brother," my father snapped. "Ask him about the agreement he's already signed with Lakeshire Development Corporation." I turned to Albert, confusion giving way to a sinking feeling of dread. "What is he talking about?" Albert had the grace to look uncomfortable, though his jaw remained set in a stubborn line. "It's a preliminary agreement, not a final contract. I signed it 3 months ago before Father's most recent heart attack, when it seemed clear that Oak Ridge would eventually come to me." "An agreement to do what exactly?" I pressed, though I already suspected the answer. "To sell Oak Ridge and its surrounding property to LDC for development into luxury condominiums," my father answered before Albert could speak. "They plan to preserve the facade of the main house as a historical feature, while gutting the interior and dividing it into high-end apartments. The grounds would be developed with additional housing units and a private clubhouse." The brutality of the plan took my breath away. It wasn't just selling Oak Ridge. It was dismembering it, stripping it of its soul while preserving its skin, as a marketable curiosity. "You agreed to this?" I asked Albert, unable to keep the horror from my voice. "It was the most financially sensible option," he defended. LDC's offer was substantially higher than what we could expect from selling Oak Ridge as a single residence. The property taxes on 5 acres in this part of Lakeshore have become prohibitive for private ownership. "And when were you planning to inform us of this agreement?" my father demanded. "After I was dead and beyond objecting? After you had convinced your mother that it was the only viable option?" Albert's expression hardened. I was waiting for the right time. And yes, I expected that the decision would ultimately be mine to make, as your heir and executor. I never anticipated that you would suddenly decide to change your will and leave Oak Ridge to Margaret after all these years. So all of yesterday's discussions, the compromise, the trust idea, that was just what? A show? I asked, feeling a fool for having believed in the possibility of reconciliation. "No," Albert insisted. "I meant what I said about being open to exploring alternatives, but you need to understand that the LDC agreement exists. It includes financial penalties if I were to withdraw at this stage. It's not something that can simply be ignored or wished." "Away." My father made a dismissive gesture. "Financial penalties that would be paid from the proceeds of the sale, no doubt. A minor inconvenience compared to the destruction of our family's heritage." "Our family's heritage," Albert repeated, his tone bitter. "Always the heritage, the tradition, the legacy. Never the practical realities of maintaining a house that's bleeding money from every crack in its foundation. Never the question of whether any of this makes financial sense in today's world. Some things are worth more than money," my father shot back. "Something you seem incapable of understanding." "Stop it, both of you," I interjected, seeing the conversation spiraling into the same old patterns of accusation and resentment. "This isn't productive. Albert, I need to see this agreement, to understand exactly what you've committed to and what options we might still have." Albert hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. "It's in my briefcase in the guest room. I'll get it." While he was gone, I turned to my father, whose face had gone pale with anger and distress. "You need to calm down," I told him quietly. "Your heart can't take this kind of stress." "How can I be calm?" he demanded. "Your brother has already arranged to sell Oak Ridge out from under us, to see it gutted and divided like some common apartment building." "We don't know the full details yet," I pointed out. "And legally, he can't sell Oak Ridge until he inherits it. If you change your will as we discussed yesterday, the decision would be mine, not his." My father's expression darkened further. "Unless the signing of this agreement creates some legal obligation that would supersede my will. That's what I need Harrington to determine." Albert returned with a manila folder, which he handed to me without meeting my eyes. "The full agreement. I have nothing to hide." I took it and began to read, my architectural training allowing me to quickly grasp the technical details of what LDC proposed. It was, as my father had said, a plan to preserve Oak Ridge's exterior while completely reconfiguring the interior to accommodate 12 luxury condominium units. The grounds would be developed with an additional 28 townhomes arranged around a central clubhouse and pool. The boathouse and lake would become communal amenities for the new development. "This would destroy everything that makes Oak Ridge special," I said, looking up from the documents. "The interior spaces, the relationship between the house and its landscape, all of it would be lost." "Preserved in a different form," Albert countered, though with less conviction than before. "The exterior architecture would be maintained, restored even. The Whitaker name would continue to be associated with the property." "As a marketing tool for luxury condos," I retorted. "Is that really how you want our family's legacy to be remembered?" Albert had no answer for that. He looked away, his expression a complex mixture of defiance and discomfort. "Mr. Harrington needs to review this immediately," my father declared. to determine what legal options we have to void this agreement. I nodded, already trying to think through the implications from both legal and architectural perspectives. I agree, but Albert is right about one thing. The financial realities of maintaining Oak Ridge can't be ignored. If we want to pursue the trust idea as an alternative to this development plan, we need to be certain it's economically viable. My father waved this away impatiently. The financial details can be worked out. What matters now is stopping this desecration before it can proceed any further. Albert's jaw tightened at my father's dismissive tone. The financial details, as you call them, are not trivial, Father. LDC has already invested in preliminary architectural plans and engineering studies. Their legal team will fight any attempt to void the agreement. The penalties for withdrawal at this stage would be substantial. Then we'll deal with those consequences, my father stated flatly. But Oak Ridge will not be carved up into condominiums, not while I have breath in my body to prevent it. The tension in the room was interrupted by my mother's appearance at the doorway. What's all this shouting about? Thomas, you know what the doctor said about getting upset. She looked between the three of us, noting the document in my hands and the angry flush on my father's face. What's happened? Albert has signed an agreement to sell Oak Ridge to developers, my father informed her, his voice tight with controlled. They plan to turn it into condominiums. My mother's expression registered shock, followed by a deep sadness that aged her face in an instant. Oh, Albert, she said softly, why didn't you discuss this with us? Because I knew Father would react exactly as he is now, Albert replied, his defiance crumbling slightly in the face of our mother's disappointment. Because I knew he would dismiss any practical considerations in favor of preserving Oak Ridge, exactly as it's always been, regardless of the cost. So you went behind our backs, she said, her voice still gentle but carrying an undercurrent of reproach. Made this decision without consulting any of us. Albert had no response to that. He looked down at his hands, the picture of a child caught in wrongdoing despite his adult status and professional accomplishments. We need to call Mr. Harrington, my father declared again, immediately. And I want to speak with this LDC to make it clear that Oak Ridge is not for sale, regardless of what preliminary agreements might suggest. I'll call him, I offered, hoping to diffuse some of the tension. And then, I think we all need to take a step back, to calm down and think about this rationally. Anger and accusations won't solve anything. My suggestion was met with reluctant nods from all parties. My mother helped my father out of the study to rest, while Albert retreated to the garden, presumably to collect his thoughts or perhaps to call Catherine, who was visiting friends in town with the children. I made the call to Mr. Harrington, briefly explaining the situation and requesting that he come to Oak Ridge as soon as possible with the revised will documents we had discussed the previous day. He agreed to arrive by late afternoon, expressing concern about the legal implications of Albert's agreement with LDC. After hanging up, I sat alone in my father's study, surrounded by the trappings of Whitaker history, the portraits of ancestors. On the walls, the leather-bound books that had been collected over generations, the antique desk where important family decisions had been made for decades. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I had come to Lakeshire expecting a difficult but straightforward conversation with my dying father. Instead, I found myself at the center of a complex legal and family dispute, with the fate of Oak Ridge hanging in the balance. What had seemed like a potentially workable compromise just the day before now felt like a distant possibility, complicated by Albert's actions and the legal entanglements they had created. And yet, beneath the complications and conflicting emotions, I found myself increasingly convinced that Oak Ridge should be preserved, not as a static monument to the past or as a financial burden to be shouldered out of obligation, but as a living space that could bridge history and modernity, private family legacy, and public educational value. The question was whether that vision could overcome the practical and legal obstacles that now stood in its way. Whether my father's determination, my professional expertise, and perhaps my brother's begrudging cooperation could find a path forward that would honor Oak Ridge's past while securing its future. What I didn't realize then was that the battle for Oak Ridge's soul was just beginning, and that the coming months would test my commitment, my relationships, and my understanding of what truly constitutes a family's legacy in ways I could never have anticipated. Chapter 7. The Battle. The next week passed in a blur of legal consultations, heated family discussions, and hasty trips between Lakeshore and Chicago as I attempted to balance the crisis at Oak Ridge with my professional responsibilities and marriage. David flew in for the weekend, offering moral support and a fresh perspective on the situation, for which I was deeply grateful. Mr. Harrington's assessment of Albert's agreement with Lakeshore Development Corporation was cautiously optimistic from our perspective. While the document was indeed binding, it was predicated on Albert's eventual ownership of Oak Ridge, something my father could prevent by changing his will to leave the property to me instead. The agreement specifies that, upon inheriting the property known as Oak Ridge, Albert Whitaker agrees to sell said property to LDC according to the terms herein, Mr. Harrington explained, reading from the document. If Albert does not inherit Oak Ridge, he cannot fulfill this obligation. So, if I change my will as we discussed, the agreement becomes moot? My father asked, hope evident in his voice. Not entirely, Mr. Harrington cautioned. LDC could potentially sue Albert for failing to fulfill the agreement, claiming that his actions, encouraging you to change your will, deliberately prevented him from meeting his contractual obligations. Could they win such a suit? I asked. Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses, a gesture I had come to recognize as his way of buying time to formulate a precise response. It would be a difficult case for them to make. Your father has every right to change his will according to his wishes. As long as he is of sound mind, which he demonstrably is, his testamentary decisions are his own to make. And the financial penalties Albert mentioned? My father pressed. Those would indeed apply if Albert were to withdraw from the agreement voluntarily. But if he becomes legally unable to fulfill the agreement because he doesn't inherit the property, the situation is less clear. It would likely come down to the specific language in the withdrawal clause and how a court might interpret voluntary in this context. Albert, who had been listening to this analysis with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. So you're suggesting that I simply accept being sued by LDC? That I bear the legal and financial consequences of Father's decision to disinherit me from Oak Ridge? No one is suggesting that, I interjected before Mr. Harrington could respond. What we're trying to establish are the legal facts so we can find a solution that works for everyone. A solution that works for everyone except the development company I've already made commitments to, Albert muttered. Commitments you had? No right to make, my father reminded him sharply. Oak Ridge was never yours to sell, not yet. You acted prematurely and with deliberate secrecy, knowing I would object. Before another argument could erupt, David, who had been quietly observing, until now, cleared his throat. If I may, he said, addressing the room, it seems to me that there are two separate issues here. First, the legal question of how to handle the existing agreement with LDC, and second, the practical question of what will actually happen to Oak Ridge in the future. Perhaps we could focus on finding a solution to the first problem that doesn't necessarily dictate the outcome of the second? All eyes turned to David, somewhat surprised by his intervention.